Hi everyone, welcome back to the History in 20 podcast. Today I'm joined by the wonderful Brooke, who is joining me all the way from Australia. So we've gone global. Brooke is an expert in ancient Greek history, and I am not at all. So I thought, who better to come on the podcast and talk about five ancient Greek mythical women than Brooke? Hi Brooke, how are you?
Hi, I'm really good. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. It's my
No problem.
first time being on a podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you've agreed to come on. It's like excellent to have you on. So, without any further ado, we'll make a start on the list. And the first one is probably one of the more famous Greek mythical women, and that is Medusa. So, what can you tell us about Medusa?
Yeah, definitely. I think she's famous, to be honest, for the wrong reasons, for the misconceptions that people have around her. So Medusa is known to be, the scary monster. She has the snakes for hair. She turns men into stone. She's evil. She's wicked. But that was not the case at all. Um, so Medusa was actually a priestess of Athena. She was or according to some mythology. Obviously, you've got the variations, they change across
Yeah.
time. Um, but the story I like of her is that she was the priestess of Athena. She was just a normal girl. One day she went into the temple to do her usual duties. And then Poseidon saw her. And you might want to put a trigger warning. I don't know. You can't really talk about Greek mythology without talking about
Yeah.
sexual assault.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, that's like the sort of warning for anyone who's like might not want to hear about that. There is a sort of sexual assault trigger, so if you don't want to listen, just like skip this bit and yeah.
Definitely. I'll keep it mild.
Yeah.
So essentially, she went into the temple. Poseidon saw her, thought she was the most beautiful woman he's ever saw. And sadly, he did assault her in the temple. And because back in these times, the women were punished, and of course, the men got away with everything, um, nothing happened to Poseidon. And Medusa was punished by Athena for sort of uh, sacrilege against her temple. And she was supposed to be a priestess of Athena. So, how dare she do something against the goddess? So, her punishment was to be turned into this monstrous being that we know her as and banished to the far ends of the world where she would never interact with anyone whatsoever. Um, that's the later myth that came on, sort of towards when we're heading into sort of CE territory. If we're looking at BC, she was a Gorgon originally. There was three sisters. She was the more prettier of the ones, and then that was why she was again sexually assaulted by Poseidon. So it's very similar. She was still punished either way, and sent to as far away as possible, so that no one would ever encounter her.
Right, that's a great like description of her, and like I've learned plenty there, just in that little bit. So I was just wondering, there's one thing I've heard, and I'm not sure whether it's like that well known or what, but was there someone who was meant to find her and they couldn't see her in a mirror or something? Is that right? You can't look in a mirror or something. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so that it was Perseus. If anyone's watched Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, they
Yeah.
sort of do like a reimagining of that in there. Um, but you're right. So Perseus was sent to collect the head of Medusa on one of his labors, and he was aided by Athena. So she gave him a sword, and he was able to use the sword as like use the reflection, sorry, to see Medusa because he couldn't look directly at her. But it was fine to look at her within the sword. And then sadly, he succeeded in chopping off her head.
Yeah, I mean that's just like history summed up in it. Like men do
Yeah,
something badly and women get punished for it.
unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for telling us about that. That's a great one to get us started on. So the next one we're
Yeah, of
looking at
course.
is Helen. So yeah, fire
Mm.
away.
Another thing I think that's a bit of a misconception around Helen is people kind of forget her earlier years. And I think her earlier years are actually probably more interesting than her later years, to be honest. We all know her as, Helen of Troy. She's taken away by Paris. She's taken to Troy and then, she's the face that launched 1,000 ships. That's what we know her as.
Yeah.
But she has a really interesting childhood. So she was born to, later.
Okay.
So later, again, apologies, was sexually assaulted by Zeus.
Right.
But on the same day, later lay with her husband. And then she bore 2 eggs. So out of these 2 eggs, depending on the story, they do differ. You had Clytemnestra, Helen, Castor, and Pollux. The story differs on who came out of which eggs at which time. But essentially, Pollux and Helen were children of Zeus, and Clytemnestra and Castor were the children of Leda's mortal husband. So Castor and Pollux, they're quite famous as well. They go off and join the Argonauts. They're quite heroic in their own feats. That's where the Gemini constellation actually comes from, is from those brothers. So Helen was regarded as extremely beautiful, even as a young girl. And at age 9, she was actually kidnapped by Theseus. So he took her away, and she was later rescued by her brothers, Castor and Pollux, which I think is very impressive because if you think about it, they were 9 years old as well.
Yeah.
Greek mythology doesn't always make sense. But,
pretty hardy 9-year-olds.
Yeah, definitely. So they saved her, they brought her back home. And then later on, of course, she marries Menelaus. He becomes king of Sparta through her, which is quite rare as well for a man to inherit his wife's sort of throne rather than the other way around. And then again, later, she is kidnapped by Paris. And depending on who you read and who you believe, she's either in love with Paris or not at all. I like to believe she was not in love with Paris. She had a husband, she had a daughter, she was a queen. Why would she want to leave her home? It doesn't make sense. But I think Helen's one of my favorite Greek mythological women, because if you look at the entire events of her life, everything that she survived is insanely impressive for a woman of Greek mythology.
Definitely.
They very rarely survived any encounters with a Greek hero or a Greek god, and she lived until her old age, and we're supposed to believe that she just died happily in the end. So
right. A rare happy ending, maybe.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe or maybe not, depending which way you believe. But yeah, another excellent introduction to another famous Greek mythological character. So the next one on the list is begins with H again. This is Hestia. Is that right? Hestia.
Yes, that's right.
So what can you tell us about Hestia? Who was she? What did she do? What's she known for?
Yeah. I love Hestia. She's incredibly underrated. But if you look at Greek mythology and the ancient Greeks themselves, she was actually the most regarded Greek goddess. She was the most important god out of all of the gods, which is surprising because hardly anybody knows about her.
Yeah.
She was more important to the Greeks than Zeus.
That's crazy. I'd never even heard of her till before this episode. So yeah, that's unbelievable. Brilliant.
Yeah, which is why I chose to talk about her, because I was like, why are not more people talking about Hestia?
Exactly.
But the thing is, the reason she's not talked about is because she just stuck to her place. She stuck to her role, which was she's the goddess of home and the hearth. So she never ever left Mount Olympus because that was her home. Her duty was to look after the hearth within Mount Olympus. So the most important hearth there was.
Yeah.
And then within every single Greek home, they had their own hearth. And that was seen as a shrine to Hestia. And it was the most important part of the home because that's what provided them with security. And, that's where they got their food from, the warmth to their house. They could use the fire to build tools. So whenever there was feasts or sacrifices, Hestia was always the first and last god or goddess to be celebrated too, because she was just the most important,
Yeah.
essentially. But she's just not talked about because she didn't get herself involved with all this other chaotic stories that the other Greek gods did. You know, she stayed in her home. She looked after her hearth and looked after the people, and she was content to do so.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting that, because like she's obviously like so important, given that you mentioned the importance of the hearth. Do you think
Mm.
maybe as well it's kind of almost an example of like sort of subservience, like women being like, well, this is the best goddess and she's like so subservient, she stays at home, she looks after the hearth, the cooking. Is it almost like a comparison how sort of even until recently women were kind of seen like that, do you think?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think Hestia would have been seen as one of the ideal sort of women,
Right.
aside from the fact that she was actually a virgin goddess, so she never married. Um, but you know, she just stayed in her realm. She did her duty, and that's what the Greek women were expected to do. Well, majority, of course,
Yeah.
except for Sparta.
Yeah. I mean that's really interesting. She's honestly like, yeah, when you said she's your favorite, she's probably
Mm.
mine now. Like, talk about being like criminally underrated or what? Like, that's
Yes, and converting
incredible.
people.
Yeah. Yeah. So our next one is, and I don't know if I'll pronounce this right, is it Persephone?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, just tell us about Persephone.
Another one of my favorites. Again, unfortunately, trigger warning for
Mhm.
Persephone. Persephone is most well known for her abduction. So she is the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. So brother and sister, so that's a bit interesting. Um, her mother was the goddess of agriculture, and Persephone is the goddess of spring. So they had a very strong relationship as mother and daughter, and also for the fact that their abilities were so similar. Later on, the Elysian Mysteries, that is based on mother and daughter. So Persephone was one day dancing in a field of flowers, very similar to sort of Medusa. Hades came by on his chariot and, you know, wow, most beautiful woman I've ever seen. He got permission from Zeus to kidnap her.
Right.
Interesting, right? But
Yeah.
he had to get permission because she's a goddess.
Oh
If
yeah.
it was a mortal woman, do whatever you want. But that's Zeus's daughter.
Yeah. Oh, he's got some
You can't
morals then. Yeah. At least you have to ask him.
slightly. Yeah. To be honest, Hades isn't a bad guy, apart from this story. I
Yeah,
actually
all
do
right.
really like Hades. There's a lot of misconceptions around him as well. But yes, so he kidnapped her, and she was not happy about it at all, which is one thing that bothers me a little bit with myth retellings is for some reason there's now this huge spin on she was happy about it, and there's all these like Hades and Persephone love stories. Like
Mm.
if you just type that in, there's a lot of
Yeah.
retellings of love stories, and I don't think people realize it wasn't a love story at all.
No.
Um, so what ended up happening was he offered her a pomegranate, and she ate a small handful of these pomegranate seeds. Back up on Earth, Demeter's going, you know, where's my daughter? She's trying to find her. She's distraught. She's walking around lost. And because of that, she's not doing her duties as a goddess. So the agriculture starts to die. And the ancient Greeks, they start to starve because nothing's growing at all. So this is when Zeus goes, oh, I might have made a mistake here.
Yeah.
And, you know, I need to fix this. So he goes and meets with Demeter and says that he will get her daughter back. Problem is, Persephone ate from the underworld. So a compromise, has to be made there. And she then has to live half of her life in the underworld and half of her life above, which is where the Greeks got sort of the seasons from. So when she's in the underworld, that's the winter dry seasons. When she comes back up, that's summer and spring when everything grows and it's all beautiful. And that's where the Elysian Mysteries came from, is when she reunites with her mother.
Right. I mean, that's so interesting. It's really interesting, like how ancient like civilizations, their sort of explanations for things like the seasons. Because when you listen to that story there, it's so like you can see how relatable it is. Like
Mm.
they didn't have like the scientific explanations that we have today for the
Yeah.
seasons, like the geographical explanations and everything. But you can see how they could justify it by that because it makes total sense. Um,
Yeah.
and another thing I was just going to ask is about when you mentioned about she ate like a pomegranate. Do you think
Mm.
that's kind of sort of an inspiration from like the story of Adam and Eve? She eats like a forbidden fruit, doesn't she? And that's like then that's sort of like they're cursed from then on or whatever. Do you think that's some sort of like similarities there, or would the Greeks have heard of the Bible by then? Or
Well, they definitely wouldn't have heard of the Bible
no?
but, at that time, but Christianity did get a lot of inspiration from ancient Greek and Roman mythology.
Yeah,
If you look at the stories, there's quite a lot of similarity. Pandora, I'm not sure if you've heard of Pandora,
yeah.
but she was the first Eve, and
Oh,
that's
right,
where
okay.
Eve came from.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, that's a good one
yeah.
for any listeners who like me didn't know that. That's a real good bit of trivia to know. I didn't know about like yeah, Pandora's box. That's obviously another one. But yeah, our fifth character to talk about today is Eris.
Mm.
Someone again, surprise, surprise, I've not heard of, but I'm sure you can talk us through and tell us all about Eris.
Well, you might have heard of her when I start
Right.
talking about her, but not have realized, because her name tends to get forgotten in the story. But I love her because she's very cheeky. So essentially, Eris started the Trojan War.
All right.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah, unintentionally, or intentionally, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah.
So, Thetis, who is a goddess, and the hero Peleus were to be wed. So they're the parents of Achilles. And their wedding was supposed to be, this huge grand event. All the gods and, nymphs and everyone was to be there. It was held in Mount Olympus, and Zeus was throwing this huge party for them. But obviously, they were worried, things might go wrong having all the gods around. So, how can we avoid things going wrong? Well, let's not invite Eris because Eris was the goddess of strife.
Right.
So she liked to cause a bit of mischief, and she reveled in it. She enjoyed it. But what happens if you don't invite the goddess of strife? She's going to cause a bit of trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah, not good planning there. So, anyways, she storms in. She waltzes up. She holds this golden apple in her hand, drops it on the feast table, turns around and walks out. And that's all she had to do. And she set off the Trojan War.
Unbelievable.
So, not sure if you recall, but the golden apple written on it, an inscription, was to the fairest,
Right.
which is when Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera all ran to this apple and started to bicker over who was the fairest, who deserved the apple. And they go running over to Zeus, who's the fairest? You have to pick one of us. And he goes, I can't pick, one's my wife, one's my aunt, one's my daughter. Like, either way, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
So who did they get to pick? Some shepherd living on Mount Ida who was also secretly a Trojan prince, that he didn't even know he was a Trojan prince. So yeah, they got to Paris and they made Paris pick. He ended up picking Aphrodite, and then he ended up stealing Helen. We know the rest of the story
Yeah.
from there. But that's just what I love about Eris. That's the only myth she's featured in, and that's all she had to do.
That's
She
amazing.
just waltzed in and created this like catastrophe, like
Yeah.
all these like domino effects of events that led to the biggest mythological war ever.
That's fascinating. And this whole list of like characters you've picked them so well because I know like obviously how much you know about like Greek mythology and stuff and Greek history, but like
Yeah.
we've got people from like Medusa sort of outcast kind of character to like Hestia, this just like totally unknown goddess, even though she's the most important. And then Eris, who's just got in one myth and causes the biggest mythological war ever.
Yeah.
It's an insane character, insane amount of characters. Like what a cast of characters that is. Great picks. They were absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I'd just like to say a huge thanks for coming on and talking about that because I've
Of
learned
course.
so much, and I'm sure all the listeners will appreciate it as well. Thanks so much again for coming on. It's been absolutely fantastic. Hope you've enjoyed
No,
it.
of course. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, really loved it.
Oh, good, good. I'm glad. Right, I'll catch you all at the next episode. Thank you.